For more than 3,000 years, one small population tucked between the mountains of northern Spain and southern France has refused to make sense. Their neighbors on every side speak languages that all trace back to the same distant root. Spanish, French, Italian, English, even Hindi and Persian, all cousins on the same family tree. And then there's Basque. It doesn't fit anywhere on that tree. Not a distant cousin, not a strange branch. It stands completely alone with no known relatives anywhere on earth. For centuries, people who lived right next door to the Basques looked at them and asked the same question travelers had been asking since the days of the Roman Empire. Who are these people, and where did they actually come from? And when scientists finally got the tools to answer that question for real, using something far more permanent than language or legend, what they found didn't just answer the mystery, it cracked it open into something stranger. Before we get to what modern science found, it's worth sitting with why this question grabbed people's imaginations for so long in the first place. The Basque Country is a small, green, mountainous region wedged between Spain and France, right where the Pyrenees Mountains meet the Atlantic Ocean. Roughly 3 million people live there today, and around 750,000 of them still speak the Basque language, called Euskara, by its own speakers. Euskara isn't just a different language from Spanish or French, it's a different kind of language entirely. Almost every language in Europe belongs to one enormous family tree called Indo-European that also includes Russian, Greek, and even languages as far away as Bengali. Euskara isn't on that tree at all. Linguists call a language like this an isolate, which just means a language with no proven relatives, living completely by itself with nobody else on Earth who's a documented cousin. Imagine every language in your neighborhood was a member of the same enormous extended family, sharing grandparents and cousins and old family recipes passed down for generations. Except one house on your street speaks a language that nobody can trace back to any of them. That's Euskara. And when a language stands that alone, it usually means the people who speak it have a history that stands alone too. It isn't only the language, either. Basque surnames sound distinct even to Spanish and French ears. Names like Etxeberria, Aguirre, or Zubizarreta don't follow the same building blocks as the surnames around them. Traditional Basque sports, like the game of pelota played against a stone wall, or the strength competitions where men lift enormous stones just to test who can carry the heaviest one the farthest, don't closely resemble the folk traditions of neighboring regions. Even the region's traditional homes, the big stone farmhouses called Basariac, follow a distinct architectural pattern that stands out clearly against the local Spanish and French countryside around them. None of this is proof of anything on its own. Plenty of cultures develop unique traditions without being a genetically separate population. But it added up, generation after generation, into a very strong, very old feeling among both Basques and their neighbors that something about this specific corner of the map simply worked differently than everywhere around it. That feeling is exactly what sent people looking for an explanation in the first place. So for hundreds of years, since long before anyone had ever heard the word DNA, people reached for their own explanations. And it's worth taking these seriously because every one of them came from a real, understandable place. People weren't being foolish. They were doing exactly what humans have always done when they run into a mystery this old. They looked at the evidence available to them at the time, and they built the best story they could. The first explanation was the oldest and the most romantic. Since at least the Renaissance, writers and scholars floated the idea that the Basques were survivors of a lost, ancient civilization. Some linked them to the legend of Atlantis. Others simply called them the last remaining fragment of the very first people who ever lived in Western Europe, untouched by every wave of invasion and migration that reshaped everyone around them. You can understand why this idea had such staying power. Here was a people with a language nobody could connect to anything else, living in the same rugged, defensible mountains for thousands of years, seemingly walled off from the tides of history that swept through the rest of the continent. If you were a scholar in the 1600s or 1700s trying to explain that, the last untouched survivors of the ancient world wasn't a crazy guess. It was the most poetic explanation available, and it gave people a story that made the mystery feel solved. The second explanation came a little later, once European scholars started seriously comparing languages to each other in the 1800s. Some linguists noticed a handful of structural similarities between Basque and languages spoken. Far away in the Caucasus Mountains, the region between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, home to languages like Georgian that are also isolates, or near isolates. This gave rise to what's sometimes called the Basque-Caucasian hypothesis. The idea that Basque and these Caucasus languages were somehow distant relatives, remnants of a much older population that once stretched across Europe and Asia before being pushed to opposite corners of the continent by later migrations. This wasn't a fringe theory dreamed up by amateurs. Respected linguists spent careers investigating it, because on the surface, two language isolates surviving in two mountain refugees thousands of miles apart is exactly the kind of pattern that makes a scientist's ears perk up. It's a reasonable hypothesis built on a real, observed pattern, even if, as we'll see, the genetic evidence tells a very different story. The third explanation is the simplest one, and it's the one most local families actually grew up believing, generation after generation. The Basques are just what's left of the original people who lived in this specific corner of Europe before anyone else arrived. Literally the direct, unbroken descendants of the hunter-gatherers who were painting animals on cave walls in this same region during the last Ice Age, more than 10,000 years ago. This idea took on a life of its own in the 20th century, when scientists first started studying human blood types and noticed something odd about the Basques. A far higher share of the Basque population carries a blood type called Rh negative than almost any other population in Europe. Rh negative simply means your red blood cells are missing a particular protein marker that most people have on the surface of their cells. It's the difference between a positive and negative blood type, like O positive versus O negative. When researchers in the mid-1900s noticed the Basques had unusually high rates of this trait, it fit perfectly with the old belief that they were a separate, ancient, isolated bloodline, untouched, unmixed, a living fossil population sitting quietly in the mountains, while the rest of Europe was reshaped again and again around them. For a family in the Basque country who had heard this story from their grandparents, it wasn't a wild theory. It was an explanation that lined up with something real in their own blood, something a doctor could actually test for. That's a powerful kind of proof to grow up with. This blood type observation became one of the most repeated facts about the Basques in the 20th century, showing up in textbooks, newspaper features, and popular science articles for decades. And it deserves a fair hearing, because it wasn't a myth pulled out of thin air. The elevated rate of Rh-negative blood among Basques was, and still is, a real measurable pattern that researchers have documented again and again. Where the story ran into trouble wasn't the observation itself, but the leap that got built on top of it. The assumption that a single blood trait proves an entire population has been sealed off from the rest of humanity since the Stone Age. A trait like this can become unusually common in a population for reasons that have nothing to do with ancient purity at all. Sometimes it's just what happens when a group of people marries mostly within a smaller circle for a long stretch of time, generation after generation, in a region where mountains and valleys naturally limit how far people typically travel to find a partner. Geneticists call this kind of pattern genetic drift, which is really just a fancy way of describing what happens when a smaller population, somewhat cut off from its neighbors, ends up with certain traits becoming more or less common purely by chance and repetition. The same way a small book club that never adds new members will end up with everyone eventually agreeing on the same handful of favorite authors, not because those are objectively the best authors on earth, but simply because that's the group they were reading in. The blood type evidence was real. The single conclusion people built on top of it, an unbroken Ice Age bloodline, turned out to be only part of the story, and DNA would eventually show which part. 3 different explanations. A lost civilization. A distant cousin thousands of miles away in the mountains of Georgia. A frozen, unbroken bloodline reaching back to the Ice Age. Each one built on real observations, real curiosity, and centuries of genuine scholarship. And each one was, in its own way, a story people needed, because without one, we simply don't know where we came from, is a very uncomfortable sentence for an entire culture to live with. It's worth remembering that for most of the time these theories were circulating, the tools available to actually test them were painfully limited. 19th and early 20th century scholars didn't have anything like modern genetics. What they had were skulls, skeletons, and rulers. An entire branch of science called craniometry grew up around the idea that you could learn about a population's ancestry by measuring the shape and size of their skulls. Basque skulls were measured, compared, and argued over by academics who were doing their honest best with the instruments of their era. Almost none of those conclusions held up over time. Skull shape, it turns out, is influenced by all sorts of things. Diet, childhood health, even how an infant's head happens to rest while it's still soft. And it's a remarkably unreliable stand-in for ancestry. That entire approach was eventually abandoned by mainstream science, partly because it produced bad answers, and partly because similar methods had already been misused elsewhere to rank and divide entire populations in ways that caused real harm. It's a useful reminder as we go forward. Every generation reaches for the best tool it has to answer a question like this one, and every generation eventually discovers its best tool wasn't quite good enough. DNA is simply the newest tool in that long line, and so far, it's the first one that actually seems to be holding up under pressure. Then geneticists opened up the genome. That's the pivot, and it's worth pausing on what that phrase actually means because we're going to lean on it for the rest of this video. Your genome is the complete instruction manual stored inside almost every cell in your body, written in a molecule called DNA. Think of it as a book passed down from your parents, who got their copy from their parents, stretching back generation after generation with small copying changes along the way. Scientists can now read that book. Not perfectly, not every single page, but enough of it to compare one person's book to another person's, and to compare the books of people living today to the books of people who died thousands of years ago, if their bones happen to survive in the right conditions. That last part is what changed everything for the Basque mystery. For most of history, the only way to study ancient people was to look at their bones, their tools, and their pottery, and try to guess who they were related to. Now, in the right circumstances, cold, dry, or mineral-rich conditions that protect DNA from breaking down, scientists can actually extract fragments of a real, physical genetic instruction book from someone who died thousands of years ago and read enough of it to compare directly to the DNA of people alive today. That's exactly what happened at a place called the El Portolón Cave, part of a larger archaeological site called Atapuerca in northern Spain, not far from the Basque country. Atapuerca is one of the most famous prehistoric sites on Earth, so well preserved that scientists have described exploring it like opening a time capsule that's been sealed for thousands of years. In the early 2010s, a team of researchers led by geneticists Torsten Günther and Matthias Jakobsen at Uppsala University in Sweden, working with archaeologist Cristina Valdiosera and colleagues, set out to do something that had never been done before for this specific question: extract and sequence, meaning read out, letter by letter, the genetic instruction books of actual skeletons buried in that cave. People who had lived there between roughly 3,500 and 5,500 years ago, during the switch from the Stone Age to the early Bronze Age. Their study was published in 2015 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, one of the most respected general science journals in the world, and it gave scientists their very first direct look at the actual DNA of ancient people from this exact region, rather than just guessing from bones and pots. Getting that data in the first place is far harder than it sounds, and it's worth understanding why, because it's part of what makes this kind of study so convincing. DNA is a delicate molecule, and once someone dies, it starts breaking down almost immediately, chopped into smaller and smaller fragments by time, moisture, and bacteria. After thousands of years, what's left inside an old bone or tooth is usually a tiny, damaged, heavily fragmented amount of genetic material, mixed in with DNA from all the soil, bacteria, and fungi that have been living in and around that bone for centuries. Extracting something usable means working in special, clean labs designed to prevent modern DNA, even a stray skin cell from a researcher, from contaminating the ancient sample, then using extremely sensitive lab techniques to fish out the old human fragments from that much larger genetic haystack, and finally piecing enough of those fragments back together, like reassembling a book that's been shredded and left in a damp basement for 5,000 years, to make a meaningful comparison possible. Researchers also use radiocarbon dating on the bones themselves, a well-established method that measures the natural, predictable decay of a radioactive form of carbon inside organic material to pin down roughly how long ago that person actually died. That's how the team was able to say with real confidence that the El Portolón skeletons lived between about 3,500 and 5,500 years ago, not just estimate it from the layer of dirt they were buried in. This is also why ancient DNA evidence carries so much more weight than the older methods it replaced. A skull measurement or a folklore comparison relies on indirect clues and a fair amount of educated guessing. A genome pulled directly from a 5,000-year-old skeleton and compared letter by letter against the genome of someone alive today is about as direct a comparison as science can offer. It's the difference between guessing what was in a sealed letter based on the handwriting on the envelope and actually being allowed to open the envelope and read the letter itself. That's part of why the 2015 study landed as such a turning point in this field. It didn't add one more theory to the pile alongside the lost civilization, the Caucasus cousins, and the unbroken Ice Age bloodline. It was the first time anyone had actually opened the envelope. Once the team had that data, cleaned, dated, and verified, they did something simple but powerful. They lined up the genetic instruction books of these 8 ancient skeletons next to the genetic instruction books of people living in the Basque country today, and next to samples from other ancient and modern populations across Europe to see who matched who most closely. And this is where all 3 of those old folk theories ran straight into the numbers. Start with the lost civilization idea and the Ice Age hunter-gatherer idea, because genetically they turned out to be tangled up with each other and both ran into the same wall. If the Basques really were the untouched, unbroken descendants of Ice Age hunter-gatherers who simply never mixed with anyone else, then their closest genetic relatives among ancient skeletons should be actual hunter-gatherers, people from before farming ever arrived in Europe. That's not what the researchers found. The ancient skeletons from El Portolón weren't hunter-gatherers at all. They were early farmers, people who had already adopted agriculture, living during the Neolithic and early Bronze Age, thousands of years after farming first spread into the Iberian Peninsula from the Near East. And it was these farmers, not the older hunter-gatherers, whose DNA most closely matched people living in the Basque country today. Dr. Gunther put it in plain terms after the study. It came out. The similarities between the ancient farmers of El Portolón and modern Basques show that Basques stayed relatively isolated for roughly the last 5,000 years, but not much longer than that. 5,000 years sounds ancient to us, and it is a genuinely long and remarkable stretch of relative isolation. But it's a completely different story from being direct, unmixed descendants of hunter-gatherers who lived 10,000 years earlier, before farming existed at all. Imagine a family that's proud of an unbroken bloodline reaching back to the founding of their town, and then discovering that the real founders actually arrived a bit later than the legend claimed, from somewhere else, and simply settled in and stayed put for a very long time afterward. That's roughly the shape of the correction here. Not a myth destroyed, but a timeline quietly rewritten. It also helps to understand what farming actually meant for population movement in this part of the world, because that's the backdrop this whole story is playing out against. Farming didn't originate in Europe. It began far to the east in the region we now call the Near East, and spread gradually across the continent over thousands of years as new communities adopted crops, animals, and settled village life instead of following herds and gathering wild food. As that lifestyle spread, it wasn't purely an idea traveling from village to village. Actual people moved too, carrying farming knowledge and their own ancestry with them, and mixing to different degrees with the hunter-gatherer communities who were already living in the areas they settled. By the time farming reached the Iberian Peninsula and eventually the region that would become the Basque country, it had already picked up a blended genetic signature, part earlier hunter-gatherer, part incoming farmer. So when Dr. Gunther's team found that modern Basques matched most closely with these early farmers, rather than with older, purely hunter-gatherer skeletons, they weren't finding a population untouched by outside migration at all. They were finding a population that had already absorbed one great wave of newcomers thousands of years earlier, and then, after that, simply stopped absorbing many more for an unusually long stretch of time. That distinction matters enormously for the story because stayed still for 5,000 years starting from an already mixed population is a completely different, far more ordinary kind of history than never mixed with anyone, ever, since the Ice Age. That same evidence undercuts the lost civilization story too, at least in its most dramatic form. There's no genetic signature in the Basque genome pointing to some separate, mysterious population unconnected to the rest of Iberia and Europe. Their DNA fits comfortably within the broader story of farmers who spread across the Iberian Peninsula thousands of years ago, and who themselves carried a mix of ancestry from earlier hunter-gatherers and from populations that had migrated in from further east. There's no sunken continent needed to explain it, and there's no unconnected mystery population either. The real explanation is quieter than the legend, but in its own way, just as remarkable. A farming population settled in this specific mountainous corner of Europe, and then, for reasons tied to geography as much as anything else, stayed relatively separate from their neighbors for thousands of years afterward. Now take the Basque-Caucasian hypothesis, the idea that Basque and languages like Georgian share a distant common ancestor. This is where the myth versus numbers comparison is easiest to picture, because the geography does the talking. The Caucasus Mountains sit around 3,000 kilometers away from the Basque country, roughly the distance across the entire continental United States. If two populations had actually stayed in genetic contact closely enough to share a recent common ancestor, geneticists would expect to see specific, traceable overlapping segments in their DNA, the genetic equivalent of two long-lost cousins still carrying obviously matching sections of the same family photo album. That's not what shows up when modern Basque DNA is compared to modern Georgian or other Caucasus populations. Their genomes look like what you'd expect from two populations that have been geographically and genetically separate for an extremely long time, not populations with a shared recent history. It's a bit like finding two families on opposite sides of the country who happen to have the same rare last name, and assuming they must be closely related, when a closer look at their family trees shows the resemblance is just a coincidence, or at best an extremely distant echo from so long ago it barely counts. There's a technical way scientists talk about how closely related two populations are, and it's worth explaining because you'll see it referenced anytime genetic studies compare groups. Researchers look at how much of two populations' DNA is shared, and roughly how far back the most recent common ancestors of those two groups likely lived, based on patterns of small differences that build up steadily over time, almost like a slow-ticking clock built into the genome itself. The longer two populations have been separate, the more small differences accumulate. Between them, the same way two copies of a story passed down separately through two different families for 100 years, We'll end up with more small differences in the details than two copies that split apart only 10 years ago. When Basque genomes are compared to Caucasus genomes using this approach, the clock reads far too long ago, deep in prehistory, long before anything resembling the specific, closely related connection the old hypothesis proposed. Any shared ancestry is the same extremely distant kind of relatedness you'd find comparing almost any two populations from opposite ends of Eurasia, not a special, close bond unique to these two groups. The linguistic similarities that first caught scholars' attention were a real, honest observation. They just weren't proof of a shared bloodline, because a language can occasionally borrow patterns or coincidentally resemble another one without the people who speak it being closely related at all. Language and genetics, it turns out, don't always travel together. And that mismatch is about to become the whole point of this story. Because here's where the mystery, instead of closing, cracks open into something even stranger. If you'd stopped the story right where we just left it, it would already make a satisfying, tidy documentary on its own. 3 old folk theories, tested against real ancient DNA, and mostly replaced by a clearer, calmer picture of farmers settling in and staying isolated for 5,000 years. Case closed. Except it isn't closed, because that explanation leaves one enormous question sitting right in the middle of the room, completely unanswered. If the Basques are genetically so similar to their farming ancestors, and so closely related to their neighbors across the rest of the Iberian Peninsula and even southern France, genetically speaking, close enough that, on a broad level, a Basque person's DNA doesn't look dramatically different from a Spanish or southern French person's DNA, then why on earth does their language stand so completely, uniquely alone? Every other population in Europe that speaks an Indo-European language shares that language because of massive, well-documented migrations that swept across the continent starting around 5,000 years ago, bringing new genes and new languages together at the same time, like a wave that changed both the water and the color of the water simultaneously. That wave reached almost everywhere in Europe. It appears to have reshaped the DNA of nearly every population it touched. And yet, in the Basque country, that same migration wave left a genetic fingerprint. Basques do carry some of that same ancestry mixed in, just like their neighbors. But somehow the language that arrived with those migrants never took hold. Nearly everyone around them ended up speaking a language from that new arriving family. The Basques didn't. That's the twist hiding inside the first mystery. It's not that the Basques are a separate, untouched people frozen in time. It's that they are genetically similar to the people around them, while linguistically being almost the last standing island on the entire continent. Somehow, this one population absorbed new neighbors, new genes, and new farming techniques over thousands of years, while its language simply refused to be replaced. Scientists still don't have a complete answer for why. Some researchers point to the mountainous, defensible geography of the region, which may have made the Basque country easier to settle into without a full linguistic takeover, the way a small mountain valley can absorb new families moving in without the whole valley changing which language it speaks at the dinner table. Others suspect the answer lies in social structure, the way position, marriage, and community identity were organized in that specific culture, which may have made the language something closer to a badge of belonging, resistant to replacement even as the population itself gradually mixed with newcomers. Nobody has fully cracked this. It remains one of the genuinely open puzzles in European prehistory, sitting right at the intersection of genetics and linguistics, 2 fields that usually tell the same story, and here, stubbornly, don't. To really feel how strange this is, it helps to know what that migration wave actually was. Starting around 5,000 years ago, large numbers, pastoralist herders began moving into Europe from the vast grassland plains north of the Black Sea, a region scientists call the steppe. This wasn't a small or subtle event. It was one of the biggest population movements in European prehistory, and ancient DNA studies across the continent show it left a massive, measurable genetic footprint almost everywhere it reached, changing the ancestry of local populations from Britain to Scandinavia to the Italian peninsula within just a few centuries. Around the same general period, a distinctive culture archaeologists call the Bell Beaker culture, named for the shape of the pottery they left behind, spread rapidly across Western Europe, including directly through Iberia, and it's closely tied to this same wave of movement and mixing. Basque ancestry does carry a signature from this era. The population wasn't sealed in a bubble, immune to everything happening around it. But somehow, in this one specific pocket of Europe, the wave that reshaped nearly every language on the continent broke around the Basque country like a river, splitting around a boulder, leaving the language on the other side almost completely untouched.